John Nichols, good to see you. How are you?
It's good. I am well. I'm speaking to you from Madison, Wisconsin, on a very near to blizzardy day. So I'm very much in my element as a upper Midwesterner.
No, that sounds beautiful. As a dude in Southern California, I'm okay not being near that stuff, but I feel like if I was in Madison, where I mean, Madison is a very walkable
Yeah.
town. I mean, we were talking about this off mic. We both love Madison, and it's a very walkable town. If I had to have a harsh winter, Madison would be one of the places I wouldn't mind being.
Well, and there's a reason for that, and it actually does speak to culture and character of places. Some places accept winter, right? They just say, okay, it's going to hit us, and it may not come immediately, but it's going to come at some point. And so there's a whole culture in the town of people. You've got the clothing, you go out, and people are walking everywhere, and even bicycling, and snowshoeing, whatever. But people get around even when it's very cold and very snowy, and I appreciate that. I worry sometimes about the transformation of America into a place that is obviously the population patterns are heading toward warmer climates. The some of our more remote northern states like the Dakotas and that struggle with population. And I that makes me sad because I love this sort of diversity of America. I think it's wonderful that we have tropical spots, but I also think it's wonderful that we have semi-Arctic spots.
Yeah, no, what you're saying, I guess for the most part, I never lived in a place like that. I mean, I grew up in Pennsylvania, so we had winter, but we didn't know how to embrace winter the way a Minnesota does or the
Yeah,
Dakotas or Wisconsin, because we just didn't get it to that extent. So, in a place like that, a Midwestern place like that, the winter is just an inconvenience, as opposed to like, oh, we just adapt and we like cross ski to the bar and just
that's right.
like let the
That's right.
time pass. So I've never experienced that other than just as a tourist. Like I've never really lived in a situation like that.
Well, come on
But
up.
are you from there?
I am. I'm deep rooted in
Okay.
Wisconsin. I am. My ancestors came to Wisconsin in the 1820s, the first of them, and they were lead miners in southwestern Wisconsin. Not a very healthy way of making a living, but then they moved into the much more honorable work of owning bars and being
There you
involved in
go.
politics. Yeah, and they've been here forever on both sides of my family. So yeah, I'm very hardwired into this place.
So I like to start to kind of get to know you a little bit better. So I wanted to kind of start at the beginning. What got you into journalism and then specifically labor journalism?
That's a good question. They actually intersect. The answers kind of intersect. I was raised in a family that was pretty political, not people that ran for office or necessarily volunteered on every campaign, but followed what was going on. And we sort of had, I think, in my childhood, it's just a sense of living history that as things happened, that was something we discussed around the dinner table, and that my mom and dad were at least somehow involved in, and same with my grandparents. And so as a result, at a very young age, I became very interested in gathering the information of the moment. And it happened. I'm old enough that I had some pretty dramatic things happen when I was a little kid, and I immediately I had the TV on or the radio on, and I was like drawing that in, very excited by that. And because I grew up in an incredibly small town, the town of 970 people when I was born, I was 971. So there you go. But we had a little small town weekly newspaper, the Union Grove Sun. And one guy was the publisher, editor, reporter, photographer, printer, ad salesman, everything. It was that one man
Wow.
or one woman shop. And I remember going down the street when I was 11 years old on my bike. And I said, I read the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, and I read about Watergate and all that. I know about all these things, and I'm reporting for duty. I want to, be a journalist. And it was such a small town that the guy said, "Oh, Carl Krieger was his name." He said, "Go for it. I'll give you $5 a story and $1 for every picture that turns out." And I was off on my bike. I covered the school board meeting, I think, that evening. And so I've been doing it since I was very, very young. And And because again, in that small town Midwestern character, it's if a kid's interested in something, you can do it. Not just because people don't. Some of the barriers aren't there. The other element of it is, and this is where it intersects, is that the little town where I grew up was about 17, 18 miles from Kenosha, Wisconsin, which was where the American Motors Company had its main factory. And it was one of the great UAW plants in the United States, a place that at one point employed over 15,000 workers on every day coming in, 15,000, building, what were once Ramblers, and then eventually got into Jeeps and things like that. But they made vehicles, some of which did well, some of which did not. But I grew up very much in a union culture. I mean, the UAW, being the president of the UAW Local 72 in Kenosha was as big a deal as being the mayor of Kenosha. And so that combination of going into journalism, and I was lucky, I got a reasonably good education in journalism. But I wanted to do labor reporting from a very young age. And so I went to, out of graduate school, I went to Toledo, Ohio, which was another big union town. And, the rest is history. I started reporting, that summer that I arrived, on farm labor issues. And I was very lucky. I spoke just the tiniest bit of Spanish, and that helped. And I also, got to cover strikes, classic union issues, but also, frankly, the decline of industry and the decline of trade unionism in much of America. So I've seen it go down, very far down, and then I've seen the fight back, which is a pretty exciting thing.
So, first of all, I love that the dude at the local paper was just like, you know what? I'm ready to double my staff. You're in, John.
Yeah, it was that big a vetting process.
So we're gonna jump around timelines a little bit now because you brought this up, but I wanted to talk to you about what you see happening with labor now. I mean, you and I have talked on a different platform about Sean Fain and the UAW strike. So what is kind of your take on where labor is now? Are you optimistic for the future?
Well, I'm hopeful. And if you read Rebecca Solnit, there's a difference between being optimistic and hopeful. Optimistic is you assume things are just going to turn out fine, and you don't really invest much in it. You just kind of gleefully hope it's all going to be good, or assume it's going to be good. Hopeful is where you believe it could turn out well. And I think that we can honestly say at this point that it is possible to be hopeful about the future of labor in America, that we believe it can turn out well. That was not the case not that many years ago. We went through a period of radical deindustrialization, neoliberalism, a period where, frankly, our laws and our structures were structured against labor, against working people. And we saw the results of that. Towns hollowed out, people, left without jobs, but more deeply, kind of whole sectors of our economy disappearing. And I wrote a lot about that. I covered the fights over NAFTA and GATT and the 1999 protests against the WTO in Seattle, and everything that's come from that over the years. And all of the dire predictions of labor activists turned out to be true, right? It was tough. It was very tough. So unions shrank. They shrank not just in their power, but also, or in membership, but also in their ability to influence politics, right? They were sort of pushed to the sidelines politically. And you saw the Democratic Party, which had traditionally been very close to unions, abandon the trade union movement on a number of issues. What's happened in the last few years has been amazing. And I think you can trace it to both practical working class and working people issues. The fight for a $15 wage, which seemed audacious at the time and now seems just common sense. The fight for a lot of other, baseline initiatives to address income inequality and unfairness and injustice. The recognition that deindustrialization really has left, huge sectors of our economy, communities, people left behind. I think that's much more understood today. And so all of this was in play. You saw a great many, particularly after Seattle, but even more so after the 2011 protests in Wisconsin and Ohio and other places, a great many young people, and with Occupy Wall Street, who came into the labor movement and said, I want to be a part of this. I want to build something back. And so I think that's the root of it. Then you had Bernie Sanders run for president. And I think Bernie Sanders' militantly pro-labor stance kind of shook the Democratic Party, drew a lot more people into politics as pro-labor activists. And, then, each step along the way, new leadership in unions, more militant leadership, takeover of unions by younger, more activist people. We've ended up with a situation now where, we've just had a union summer, right? Where major unions went on strike or threatened to strike and had big victories, won huge contracts, and are preparing to go do a lot more. That's the UAW, that's the Teamsters, that's a lot of other unions. We're nowhere near where we ought to be. I report a lot around the world. I spent a lot of time in Scandinavia and in Iceland. In Iceland, everybody's unionized, right? If you go on a boat to look at the northern lights, the people on the boat are unionized, right? Everybody is. And it works as a society. We're kind of the opposite of that. We have only a small portion unionized, but I do think that
and we don't work as a society.
No, absolutely not. We have massive inequality. Well said. Well said. And so just the last thing I'll say about it is that I think that it is within reason that in the next 5 years, we could double union membership in the United States. Now, that requires labor law changes. That requires a lot of militancy. It requires, frankly, a lot of political barriers to be taken down. There's all sorts of challenges. But I actually think that's possible. And if I'm right, then, we are looking at something that may not be a full-on New Deal era, but we have an era which at least has that possibility.
Well, even to me, it's so interesting. And I'm sure, you could really speak to this in droves, but it's like we've had 60 years of anti-union propaganda fed down the American people's throats. And also just efforts to decimate the unions, have, like some unions don't have the best leadership, which then will sour people to the whole idea of it. And we have to basically fight back against all of that. And it gets, it's not easy to do. Yet, despite all that, you're seeing stuff that I never would have thought I'd see. I mean, even just like the effort at Starbucks comes to mind first, where they were just union. I mean, at first it was like this one shop voted to unionize, and it was, oh man, wow, I can't believe this happened. Then it feels like in a matter of weeks, you couldn't keep track of all of them. It was almost every shop, and it was freaking awesome to see. So I mean, was that inspiring to you? Like were you expecting that?
Inspiring. No, I mean, it's kind of it's the reason I went into this game was to write about that, and it's and this is a terrible analogy, right? But the reason you go into political reporting, and I do a lot of political reporting, is to write about elections. You can lie and say, oh, well, I'm really interested in governing and stuff like that. But by and large, most people that go into political reporting want to write about elections. You want to go into war reporting, you probably intend to write about war, et cetera, et cetera. You want to go into business reporting, you want to write about businesses that are making a whole bunch of money. If you go into labor reporting, what you want to write about is labor on the march, right? You don't want to write about labor in decline, right? You don't want to say, oh, wow, I'm here to, preside over the end of the labor movement or to put the period on the sentence. No, you're interested in it as a dynamic force in our society. And so, is it inspiring to see what's going on? Absolutely, it is. But what I will tell you, Ron, and I think this is important, the inspiration has always been there, right? It's just been isolated and it hasn't been given the attention that it needs. I've written about labor, not always. Sometimes I've been much more on the political side, but I've been writing about labor for decades. And there's never been a year where there hasn't been a struggle someplace, where somebody isn't organizing courageously in the rural South and in right to work states in the West and in factory towns that have just been abandoned. There's always somebody out there doing it and heroes that you can write about. What's different now is two things. One, critical mass. There's a lot more of it going on. Frankly, being pro-union is cool. Being engaged in trade unionism is cool. Polling shows 2/3 of people are excited about it. And the dynamic folks in our society, young people, right, not the only dynamic people. I don't want to be, ageist, but the folks who are, ready to go out and do something. Polling shows that something like almost 90% of young people have pro-union sentiment, right? It's just through the roof. And so that gets you to critical mass. And then the other part of it, which is, another part of my life, because I write a lot about media, the social media, with all of its flaws, has made it possible for that isolated person in Alabama who's organizing, or in Wyoming who's organizing, to spread the word, right? And so suddenly you've got allies and comrades and friends around the country, even around the world. And that's profound, because one of the most difficult things for trade unionism has always been isolation, right? Trade unionism doesn't work on the individual level, right? Trade unionism works with groups of people coming together. And if it's a small group of people in an isolated spot, maybe a place that doesn't have a union tradition, that can be very alienating. It can be very difficult. So I do think that the modern era, with social media, with a lot more communications, has made it possible for people to connect up, link up with one another, and build this movement out. And so that's why I think the combination is pretty good right now.
So let's go backwards a little bit. When I first heard about, like, when I first became aware of you, it was through some of your articles, and then also your Dollarocracy book with Dr. Bob McChesney. I was very interested in the media reform movement. I think I've read pretty much all of his books of that era. And I remember there used to be the Media Reform Conference that Free Press sponsored, among others. I remember you were there. And that all kind of seemed to have fractured off from about like 2013 to present. And, I was just sort of an outsider looking in, going to stuff when I could. And I was like just out of college and about to go into graduate school. But what's like your perspective of all that? Like what's kind of your take on that timeline, and what happened and what fractured, and where things are at now?
Yeah, I don't know that it fractured. I'm not sure that's the right word.
Okay.
Although I would be very cautious about debating a comedian on choice of words. But
I'm not married to fractured. You can.
Yeah. I mean, but I think the movement's still relatively united. The problem is that the industry has fractured, right?
Okay.
And so the targets have changed, and much of what we're dealing with is different than when we started. Bob McChesney and I started writing about media in the 1990s, late 1990s. At that point, media was in a period of radical change, which we didn't even fully understand. Not even Bob and I, even though we were some of the first people to write about digital media and things like that. And it was still a time when, the dominant source of news gathering in most communities was a big newsroom at a big newspaper, right? And when that newspaper hit your doorstep on Sunday morning, it was so big and so heavy it could crack the cement, right? Those newspapers are gone in huge portions of the country. We also still had a reasonable amount of independent radio at that time. That's been, the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which was one of the things that really got Bob and I starting writing about some of these issues. That has decimated a lot of commercial radio. And then you've got, changes in television, it's systematizing of television. We knocked down barriers to cross ownership, and not all of cross ownership, but in some cases. And so we've ended up in a situation where a lot of what were traditionally independent stations are now kind of all interwoven with companies, interwoven with one another. I could go into it, but we don't have enough time. What I can tell you, frankly, is that the media system blew up, right? We had this digital moment, which allowed advertising to flee out of commercial media, right? And the source of resources, or the resources that sustain journalism, went elsewhere. And so this, Ron, because every time you look up, how to buy a new pair of shoes online, if you don't buy that pair of shoes, what do you see the next day? They're back trying to sell them to you, right?
Oh yeah.
Newspaper
Or
can never
similar
do that.
shoes.
Yeah. Right. But the newspaper can never do that. There were even radio and television. I mean, you love it or hate it, what digital does, what an online communications does, is allow for commercial entities to chase after you at a very micro level, at a very personal level. That's gold for them, but it's a nightmare for media, which used to go in this big kind of blanket. And so the resources fled. Newsrooms shrank. We're now at a point where we will have lost about a third of the newspapers we had in 2005, just over the last 15, 18 years. We've lost tens of thousands of working journalists. Online media, online news operations have not begun to fill the gap. In fact, it's roughly a 10-to-1 ratio. You lose 10 journalists in traditional media, you get one replacement. And that's a somewhat of an unfair characterization, but it's relatively accurate. And what we know is that we are seeing a radical collapse even of a lot of online media efforts, right? They are great. Sometimes they do really good work, but they don't always survive. So we're in a point now where journalism is in massive crisis at the local and regional level. At the national level, it still works because it's sort of a one size fits all, and you've got some things going on there. But we've really lost it in a lot of this country. I had a big Nation magazine piece on this a couple of weeks ago, and I was surprised by how much response there was, because people basically were like, yeah, boy, that's our experience. And so what that's done to the media reform movement is take a movement that was saying at one time, wow, media just doesn't do a good job, right? And it needs to be better. It needs to be more responsive to people of all races, all creeds, all backgrounds, all experiences. It needs to be more integrated into its community. It needs to be able to speak truth to power rather than simply respond to power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all those things that we would say. It needs to be independent. Ownership needs to be more diverse, et cetera. Well, we said all that stuff, and then the system changed so much that now one of the things we're looking at is a system that isn't even there, right? That you're saying, well, newspapers should be better. Of course they should be, but they're closing left and right. Journalists should do a better job. Yes, of course we all should do a better job, but we're being laid off left and right. And so a lot of what was the media reform movement of the early 2000s, when free press got going and some of those great conferences that you were at occurred, a lot of that has transferred now into a salvage effort, right? An effort to try and find a new way, a new model for journalism to survive in the 21st century. And it's intersected with a lot of the crises we have in our politics, because if we don't have a steady flow of solid information, which we can agree with or disagree with on, we can have our disagreements about, the issues, but there's some sort of core of information coming. Unless we have that, we're going to, silo off into incredibly angry and divided communities, which are unlikely to work with one another. And, you kind of end up in a slurry of misinformation, lies, propaganda, etc. And so we're now in this urgent point where we have to figure out how to recreate media, to create a media system that does journalism, that does give people the information they need, but is independent and free of, government influence, free of corporate influence, etc. That's very hard. There's a lot of experiments going on right now, but I think that's where an awful lot of the energy of the movement is. And frankly, it's frustrating and it's hard. And I think the people who are working on it are heroes. Even if I disagree with them, I'm still involved to some extent with free press. I still write about these issues a lot. But I want to tell you that if you came to me for an easy solution to this, I'm going to tell you, we're not in a place with easy solutions. We're in a place that's tough right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So getting into the political side of things then.
Yep.
And I know you do some political reporting. I've seen that side of your work. I think, and I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like, most of your passion kind of lays more in the labor movements than political. But I wanted to ask you, do you have any hope that the Democratic Party itself could be a vehicle for progressive change at the federal level? And if so, how could that happen?
It's a very good question. That's the oldest question in the history of politics, right?
Yeah.
It's been asked probably now for more than a century. And in fact, I wrote a book on this called "The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party." And the basic premise of the book was that since the end of Roosevelt's presidency, since around 1944, there's been a fight for the soul of the Democratic Party, and that every time progressives, the left, came close to getting control of the party, they were either shut down, or if by chance they actually got the nomination, like McGovern in 72, then the party elites actually supported the other guy. There was a huge group in 1972 that I write about in the book called Democrats for Nixon. They just literally said, oh, we've had this competition in our party. We lost. We're not going to support the guy that the members of the party nominated. And they undercut McGovern, horribly in that campaign. And it's happened again and again. Yeah. And so one thing you have to understand is that the Democratic Party is a little bit like, Lucy with the football and Charlie Brown, right? Progressives they come running to kick that ball, and they work out, they get better at, and everything, but Lucy always pulls it up. And so then the question is, well, do you just say to Lucy, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. We're leaving this party. The problem with that is that the American political system is structured to favor a two-party system. And the bias in our system, both in our actual political processes, in the parties themselves, and in our media, is so overwhelming that to try and form an independent political force is very, very difficult. And so I have tended, but I'm not all the way here, I've tended to be in the camp that says that trying to take over the Democratic Party, right, trying to move it to the left, is not take it over, but trying to, in fact, that's actually the wrong phrase. Let me use a different phrase. Let me say, trying to give power to the base of the Democratic Party so that it can actually lead that party rather than the elites that operate in a few blocks of Washington, D.C., that's still a worthy effort, right? And as Michael Moore has said, in most of the United States, the Democratic Party is moribund, right? There isn't much there. And so you can kind of crawl into the shell and make it into something. The reality is, of course, that you've got to do that better than it's been done up to this point, right? And I think that the Sanders campaign in 2016 especially sort of shocked the party, right? It was amazed that the elites were amazed that this thing happened. I think the media was amazed that this thing happened. And I think that, frankly, Sanders and the people around him were amazed that it happened. And it did so well that that had people known from the start that it was going to do as well as it was going to do, it probably would have taken over the party, right? They probably would have succeeded. But there was a lot of catch up there. By the time 2020 came around, a lot of the party elites, the party establishment was better prepared to, see off a challenge from the left. And then you had COVID come, which really, upset things in a lot of ways. All these negatives. But here's the interesting thing. What you should always worry about in politics is not whether you win yourself, but whether your ideas win. And what's fascinating is that on balance with Joe Biden on domestic policy, a lot of progressive ideas have won, right? He's been forced to the left on a lot of things. Not enough. I'm deeply unsatisfied. But what I'm saying is, it's clear that when Biden wakes up in the morning, he says, well, I got to think about some of these things because there's people making noise about this. That wasn't, when Clinton was there, when Bill Clinton was president of the United States, he woke up in the morning and said, well, what is Wall Street worried about? Right? And so something has shifted. The base of the Democratic Party has become louder and more effective, and it has had influence. And you see rising figures getting elected, members of the Squad and others. But with all that said, and that trying to end on a slightly positive note, I will tell you, it is still, as I said in the book, a fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. And that is an ongoing fight. The elites, the powerful, are very well organized, and they know they're in an ongoing fight. The left, progressives, I think kind of regroup every time, and I think are not always as aware that it's a permanent struggle, and that if you take your eye off the prize for a moment, the elites are going to fill that space.
Well, I think it's also a struggle where we have a winless record. So you're kind of looking around and you're going, I mean, for me personally, like speaking as an individual, over the past 8 years or so, as somebody who, as soon as I was awake politically, I kind of went to the left, and it was the Iraq War. Before the Iraq War, I was pretty apolitical. I was just, just a kid playing in punk bands, hoping girls liked me. And then the Iraq War happened, and by
the way, I'm going to stop you right there, brother. Every cool person in politics came out of a punk band. Just that's, I mean, it's, and I mean,
I'm
the
gonna quote you
touchstones,
on that.
it's the Clash and Billy Bragg, right?
Yes.
And and a couple others, and so I just want to emphasize that I shouldn't say everyone. That's unfair. There's obviously some people that were in ska bands, but the bottom line is that at some fundamental level, you come in, if you're going to bring to politics any more than just kind of the standard behaviors, right?
Mm-hmm.
You got to come from someplace else.
Totally, totally. Yeah. No, you know what? It's funny. I have a Joe Strummer T-shirt that I wear quite frequently, and the other day I was wearing it, and the only letters visible. I had a jacket on. The only letters visible were the T, the R, the U, and the M. So some people were confused by my T-shirt.
Okay.
They
I
were
got
like,
you.
"Is that?" And I was like, "Wait a second."
Uh,
Yeah, I was like, the
man,
ironic thing. This is
there's the
about
roots
as
of a
far.
comedy routine here.
I am working on a bit about it because it's like, the irony being like that's about as far from a Trump t-shirt as one could
Oh yeah,
possibly wear. like when
yeah.
you think about it. Like so but I guess like the frustration, and I know like this conversation we've been having it for generations. We're going to continue to have it.
Yeah.
Where it's like for me personally, the past 8 years have really just confirmed all my worst suspicions, where it's like I feel like the Democratic Party just does not want lefties anywhere near
Nope.
it, and they don't. And
Nope.
then you see, I mean, yeah, I was very happy when squad members were getting elected, and I thought this is the start of something. Yet you see them not work as a block, and the frustrations that have happened because of that. We know you're grossly outnumbered, but you're not voting together, and that's what we need you to do if we want you to have any type of leverage. And so
Well,
I feel like
and then it may all blow up again because they're now all going to be, most
they'll
members
be
of the squad
targeted.
are going to be targeted this year
Yeah,
because of Gaza,
yeah,
and their stances on that. And so, again, this gets to that difficult reality where it's one step forward, two steps back, and politically that's very, very frustrating. So the question always is, what do you do, right? Do you give up or do you go on? And of course the answer is we're going to go on. And then how do you do it? Well, the thing that I suggest is have less respect for political parties and more respect for the movements, right? And if a movement can get animated within a political party and make something happen, great. If it can't, then work from the outside to influence it. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who we will celebrate in coming days and the anniversary of his birth, was a brilliant political strategist, and yet he very rarely did politics in the classic sense. He refused to make endorsements. Right? He would just comment on elections. He didn't go out and campaign, at Lyndon Johnson's side or something like that, because he felt the civil rights movement was above that. And in fact, in those days, amazingly enough, you had a lot of Republicans that were very pro civil rights, often more than many Democrats. And so King wanted to keep it there, but he wanted to build a movement that was strong enough to influence the body politic, the bigger politics. And so I do think that it is relevant to, put energy into movements that seek to influence the whole of our politics, right? And in this case, because of what's happened to the Republican Party, it's most likely that they influence the Democratic Party. But I think that it's totally relevant to say that the Democratic Party has failed on a whole bunch of issues, and that it's going to push people away. And so if you create a movement that's big enough, right, that's strong enough, then the Democratic Party comes to you rather than you going to the Democratic Party and begging. And so I guess, up off bended knee and on to, marching is the way to go. And I do think that that's why we come back to labor.
Yeah.
Right. We started talking about labor, and it frustrates me when labor unions endorse a political party early on or endorse a candidate early on. I think labor unions should be, they should want to make sure that their endorsement is valued, and it comes at the point where the party realizes that they're needed, right? And so it's notable that at this point the UAW has not endorsed in the presidential race, and they had reasons for that. And I think that's appropriate. I think that ultimately unions should engage, and it's fine. It's
absolutely
good to endorse, but if they hold back a little while and get a little more concessions, get a little more commitment, I think that's a good thing. And I think, to my mind, that's something we're seeing with the rise of this new leadership in trade unionism, where union leaders are willing to, and union activists willing to hold back their endorsements until political candidates and political parties make it absolutely clear that when they get to power, they will, treat organized labor not as a special interest, but as what it is, which is the representative voice of the working class in this country, right? Not the entire working class, because not everybody's organized, but a voice that actually says we want a better share for the working class. And so I guess if I had to say, where is my hope, right? My hope is with the labor movement.
Mm-hmm.
And my ultimate hope as regards the labor movement is not just the labor movement get strong as regards bigger membership, more plants represented, more stores represented, more communities organized, but that they get strong enough that the Democratic Party and maybe even some elements of the Republican Party are like, oh, we can't mess with these guys, right? We have to respect where this is coming from. And so energy put into building up the labor movement, I think, is one of the best, quote unquote, investments in a better politics.
Absolutely, 100%, and yeah, I personally, I hope that they do not endorse unless they get a list of concessions longer than a CVS receipt. I mean, honestly, like I think they should just, yeah. So I'm with you there. Well, let's talk. Let's transition a little bit into 2024.
Sure.
You said that you've been massively disappointed by Joe Biden, which I agree with 110%. I think you're putting it diplomatically. Thank you.
I am
You said that there were some areas, where he was pushed left. I don't even think I don't think I would go that far. So what are some examples of what you would call some wins?
Sure. Look, some of the appointments have been good.
Okay.
And so I'll start there. I don't think you're going to do better than Ketanji Brown Jackson for the Supreme Court. You know what I mean? And so let's recognize that personnel and appointments, that's policy, right? That's how you make things happen. And so I do think that progressives have gotten some powerful appointments, some good judicial appointments, some good cabinet, people in positions of power that can do some stuff. There's a struggle right now over the Secretary of Labor position, and frankly, Biden's pick is a good pick. But so that's one place to begin. The other thing is that when the Build Back Better fight went on, at least initially, there was very little question that Biden deferred to Bernie Sanders and was actually, trying to work with Sanders on some of those issues. And, they definitely got screwed over by, Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, handful of others, and also by their own caution, frankly. They weren't willing to change the rules to get rid of the filibuster and to move on some of those things. And so, in fairness, I think that you could look at the early parts of the Biden administration and say, you know what, there were some things here that looked like they had real possibilities. I thought the initial Build Back Better plan, while not what I would have done, was pretty good, right? It had ambition there. And it listened to the left rather than simply listening to the traditional sources of information. I remember how exciting it was to report about that in 2021, in those early stages, and just talking to activists who've been at an issue for 10 years, 15 years, and we're suddenly saying, yeah, I'm talking to the White House, right? But it hasn't come to fruition. So here's the areas where I would point my biggest disappointment. And that is not necessarily in policy. And I understand people who would focus on policy, and I totally respect that. There's things that I'm hugely disappointed that we haven't had, federal action in a meaningful way to change policing and criminal justice, right? I'm deeply disappointed that, we have not done enough on climate, we keep talking about it, but it keeps getting ahead of us. But I'll give you a couple, those are policy ones, but let me give you some practical ones just on if you were sort of taking care of your own side, right? This is very, pragmatic politics. The fact that Democrats had control of the House, Senate, and the White House, and they didn't pass the PRO Act. They didn't make a situation, create a circumstance where labor could organize without all the barriers that exist, could have a fair playing field. That wasn't done immediately is jaw dropping, right? I mean, it's just that's a failure. And when you finish a 4-year term and you have not made fundamental changes in like labor law, to me, that's an area of that's a red alarm, right? That's a red alert of a big problem. Now, I will admit, as somebody who covers labor a lot, Biden's appointments to the NLRB and some of the other stuff he's done has been quite good. So there's been progress. I'm not denying it, and I certainly wouldn't suggest that if the Republicans were there, they'd be doing a better job. Not at all.
Sure, sure.
But what I am saying is that, come on, when you come in, you've got that moment, you've got power, use it immediately to create a fairer playing field, so that then, those who frankly kind of, I think, agree more with a lot of your positions on the issues have more power to express their views, right? They've got more of a traction. And why doesn't that happen? I fear, that there are elements of the Democratic Party that frankly don't want a well-organized grassroots, right? They don't want to cede too much power outside of traditional politics, because if the movements get strong enough, that means they might not be calling the shots anymore. And so the caution on that is what really frustrates me.
No, I hear you, and I, I think all the points you brought up are very valid and very good ones. But then you see the frustration. I mean, when you talk about appointments, one thing that comes to mind too, and this is an issue that we both are passionate about, the FCC appointment. I mean, this is a president that started his campaigning with a bunch of Comcast executives. So, spoiler alert, net neutrality wasn't very high on his priority list. He promised a pro-net neutrality FCC as a result of the Bernie Biden task force, which, like, okay, great. We got a promise out of him. Is he going to keep it? He did keep it. It took 3 years.
I know.
Like most presidents, it takes a couple weeks. Now, I know not all that lands on him. There was that big right-wing smear campaign against Gigi Sohn. I don't discount any of that. But he's the president. He didn't use the bully pulpit for anything because, let's be real, he doesn't really care. And it's like, you're just...
I think you hit on something that's really powerful there. I don't know if he cares or not. I've covered Joe Biden for a very long time.
All right.
And when you say he doesn't really care, I don't know. You know what I mean? I think there may be some things he really does care about. And particularly with working class folks, maybe some sympathy. But it's the second part of what you said that's so valid. And that is the bully pulpit.
Right.
Joe Biden's use of the bully pulpit has been so insufficient over the last 3.5 years. It's just shocking. And I write a lot about Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt was a son of privilege, right? He was a wealthy guy who, lucked into being the governor of New York and then the Democratic nominee for president in 1932 in a very difficult moment in American history. He took over in the midst of a depression. He could have gone one of two ways. He could have been managerial or he could have been change-oriented, right? He chose to be change-oriented, not perfect. There are many flaws in Roosevelt, but he wanted to do a lot. And what did he figure out? Radio. He's like, I mean, now we make it into this sort of romantic thing. Oh, he did, like fireside chats. No, that was organizing. That was aggressive efforts to make America get on the side of great big changes. I've written about this. Roosevelt even used his Thanksgiving messages, about, like we're all going to get together with our families on Thanksgiving and put in major political components to them, literally talking about wealth and poverty and, power and elites versus the working class into his Thanksgiving statements. He used every aspect of the bully pulpit. That's why the New Deal was as big a deal as it was. And I just think the Democrats are going to be in power, right? What they need most of all is somebody that knows how to use the bully pulpit.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the thing about FDR too, and yes, there were some stains during that administration. We don't have,
totally.
I mean, we could talk about that all day, but he had foresight. I mean, he wasn't some big lefty or anything like it. He just had the foresight where he basically went to his rich friends and he said, okay, you see them out there, they're mad. So you're either going to give up a little bit or you're going to give up everything. Your choice. And then we got the New Deal.
And the thing about Roosevelt that was incredible, and this is almost unheard of in American politics, in power he moved left.
Yep. Yep.
Generally, one of the rules that I when I cover politics, people say, well, what do you need to know about politics? One of the things I always tell people is nobody's ever better during their campaign than they are. Nobody's ever better in office than they were during their campaign, right?
Yeah.
You
No kidding.
promise a lot, and then you get in office and you turn out worse, right? That's standard operating procedure, except with Roosevelt, who actually promised in 32 a little, and then came in and gave a lot, and then in 36 moved way to the left, saying about bankers, "I welcome their hatred," right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1940, he's got to get rid of John Nance Garner, the Southern segregationist, who was his vice president. And instead of picking another Southern segregationist, which is in that Democratic Party, pretty easy thing to do, he picks Henry Wallace, who's the most left-wing member of his cabinet. And, they go out and not only get us ready to fight fascism in World War II, but, it ultimately was tripped up by the Democratic elites, but basically tried to set the agenda for a post-war era in which we addressed issues like race. I mean, it was, for all the flaws of Roosevelt, he did seem to be moving to the left, his trajectory. And so you got the Economic Bill of Rights, you got the Four Freedoms and things like that, not at the start of his administration, but deep into it. And that, to me, I mean, that's, for lack of a better term, that's what's magic in politics if you get something like that, because then people can get excited. Then they think, wow, this is going to keep on getting better. This is where maybe I'm unsatisfied with something, but I can keep pushing. We're going to get more. And I don't think the Democratic Party offers people that now. I don't think people say, oh, wow, if I elect a Democrat, it's just going to get better and better.
Yeah. It's
a
more
problem.
like just it's damage control, really,
Yeah.
is what goes through most people's head. I mean, even with Biden, it's like something like 70% of voters, they weren't really voting for him. They were just
No,
voting
you're voting
against
against the other
Trump.
guy. But then there's another thing too. You're saying damage control, which I think is an accurate term. The term that I use, and I borrow it from William Greider, the great political writer who, I think was really a genius in understanding the systems. He said that what happened to the Democratic Party after a certain point was that as the Republican Party moved further to the right, the Democratic Party became a managerial party, i.e., that they would say, give us power. We're not going to change things. We're just going to manage them better than these crazies, right? The other guys are extreme or dangerous or bad. So give us power. We'll be good managers. Well, what that does to our politics is it sort of empties it out, right? It's got this one kind of, fire-breathing, angry, loud right wing. And then the alternative to that is, the night manager at Walmart. It's not very exciting. And I think that's where we're at right now. We have a politics that is sapped of the excitement that is needed. And that is one of the reasons why I'm on the left. There's no question of that. And I think the left should, assume that it does speak for the great majority of Americans. And that, maybe there's work that has to be done to figure out how to communicate better. Maybe there's work to be done to identify the issues and build the coalitions, all of that. But that, there shouldn't be an assumption that, the choice is between an energetic, loud, I think often dangerous right and a boring, centrist, managerial Democratic Party, right? And until you get beyond that, I think we're going to be stuck in this, what we've got right now, which is that, we get really excited when we have a voter turnout level that would be seen as a crisis in Germany or Scandinavia or many parts of the world, because we have such low turnout. If we had super high turnout elections where people were really energized and really looking for change because they felt they could get it, I think we could, as a country, move forward very fast in a lot of very important ways. We could have Medicare for all. We could have free education. We could have all the things that we sometimes talk about as dreams, but that in fact are realities in countries around the world.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. And in most industrialized country. And yeah, I hear what you're saying. And I would say that it's even slightly worse than stuck because, it's not like we're just stuck. What is also happening is that crazy mouth breathing right is getting crazier and crazier and more extreme. So then the night manager at Walmart is becoming worse and worse themselves. I mean,
Well, yeah, kind of moving. Yeah, kind of. That's the thing when you move the center of gravity to the right, right? It does move to the right, and
yes,
and so that, and I guess that's we don't have a lot of time left, but I think that's a
yes,
good way to kind of circle around here and to say that you asked me about optimism and hope at the start of this conversation, and I would say my hope and my enthusiasm is when I look at Sean Fain, and I mean here's Sean Fain. Love him or hate him, think of what you will. He goes into this strike against the big three, which is incredibly powerful, multi-billion-dollar multinational companies. And instead of when things get tough, when everybody's writing him off, when the CNBC is saying this can't work, blah blah blah, he doesn't like blink. He goes deeper in. They say, well, what you're talking about sounds like class warfare. And so what does he do? Appears with an "Eat the Rich" T-shirt, right?
Yes, he did.
I mean, that is what works, because instead of coming from a place of fear and of uncertainty, you're presenting an image of strength and of vision, and I think that's why when I do work with the nation, we do an honor roll every year, and at the top of the honor roll is Sean Fain, because when you look back on this year, there are many heroes, and Cori Bush and Rashida Tlaib in Congress, and Jeff Merkley over in the Senate is doing great work. I can run down Rebecca Solnit with her incredible book on climate. It's just, there's a real list of heroes, but yet the person that I kind of really connected with, for maybe it's personal reasons, was Sean Fain, because it was just every time that it got tough, he upped the ante.
Yeah,
and he closed it out by renewing the UAW's commitment to not only speak on domestic policy but foreign policy.
Yes,
kind of amazing.
Yes, no, that was very powerful. And hey, I like the guy for all the reasons you mentioned. Plus, we're both Hoosiers, so
oh well, yeah. But it's Kokomo versus Bloomington, man. That's a big. There's a difference there, and I mean, do you realize that if Sean Fain keeps going, there's going to be people doing pilgrimages to Kokomo?
Yeah, that's his hometown. Yeah.
That's right.
I meant we're both alum, but yeah, same.
I hear you.
John, I know you got to go. Thank you for being so generous with your time. In closing, where can people go to find your stuff and learn more about you?
Look, I would, I believe in media, and trying to do the best with our media. And so I would encourage people to come to the Nation website, www.thenation.com, where I post a lot, where other great people like Ellie Mistal and others do. And come on over. I think we're saying some important stuff there. I'm on Twitter, I do some other things there. And then the other thing is, if you want to see what I'm doing, this is it. I do a lot of podcasts. I do a lot of independent media, probably, 8-10 things a week. And the reason for that is because I passionately believe that we need an alternative media in this country. We don't need the same people saying the same things, being heard again and again in their silo. We need to keep building out independent media. And so I'm thrilled that you're doing what you're doing. I want you to keep doing it, amplify it more. And, I'll come back and we'll, sometime I'll be begging to be on your show.
Cheers, Sean. Well, thanks so much for doing this, man. Next time we cross paths, first spotted bear's on me.
All right.
Spotted cow. I misspoke.
Spotted cow is the.
Sorry about that.
Don't worry, brother. We'll talk to you soon.